My name is Augusto Semmelroth. I'm originally from Brazil. I come from a farming background in Brazil. My family has been farming there for over 6 generations. The project that you mentioned, the Garwin project in Australia, is a very specific project. Is a large-scale farm, one of the largest farms we have in Australia. So it's 80,000 hectares. So it's a very large-scale, extensive grazing. A farmer that is pursuing these new systems or a regenerative system has very clear in mind what are his goals from managing his land. Having the drip irrigation subsurface, you're saving up to 30% on the water they're using, so there's a clear benefit there. A lot of the transition and these changes will probably come from the younger generations that are more keen to take those risks. There's a lot of steps and there's always more to be done. There's always new learnings. It always comes down to the farmer aptitude for change.
Welcome to our Carbon Farming Odyssey, a journey across uncharted territories where soil is not just earth, but a living asset. Together, we set sail across the vast ocean of sustainable agriculture, mapping new value chains and covering hidden opportunities, cooperating and cultivating the future of farming.
In today's episode, we welcome a business analyst, a true explorer of agricultural frontier. With experience spanning of company SLM Partners, we bring today insight in how carbon farming is reshaping our landscapes, our economy, and our climate resilience. Let's dig in. The adventure begins now.
Thanks.
Hello, Augusto. It's great to have you here. Firstly, I would like to ask you, could you begin by sharing your personal story, what brought you to SLM Partners and what drives you and your passion to regenerative farming?
Thanks first of all, Piotr and your team from IUNG from having me here and inviting me for the podcast. It's been a very useful day yesterday, seeing the conference and going to the site fields and seeing the work you're doing on the scientific front and how academia is taking this very specific focus on soil and soil microbiology and different farming systems that promote soil health and other things that are quite critical in terms of providing more resilience to farming and adapting to climate change and also sequestering carbon and this sort of thing. So it's very, very interesting to see these in the Polish context. My name is Augusto Semmelroth. I'm originally from Brazil. I come from a farming background in Brazil. My family has been farming there for over 6 generations, mostly with beef cattle production. But in the most recent years, we've been doing other crops and diversifying to sugarcane, integrated livestock and cropping systems with corn, soybean, and other crops. So that's my family history and background in agriculture. So I've been born and bred into this environment. I didn't grow up on the farm, but we are always in contact with farming and the family business in that way. Then, as my dad is an agronomist, my godparents are agronomists, and there was kind of like a bit of not a clear path for me to go towards studying agronomic engineering, but it was kind of what ended up happening. So I studied agriculture engineering at the University of São Paulo. And then towards the end of my degree, I just had a feeling that I was very science, production-based kind of studies, and then I felt a lack of understanding of agriculture in the broader sense of things like the economy part of agriculture, finance and management. So I decided to move to Australia to do a master's degree in agribusiness. And the plan was to stay there a couple of years and go back to Brazil, but then I eventually stayed there for six years and working in agricultural commodity markets, went back to Brazil to restructure the family business, and then ended up going to London for personal and career reasons close to 10 years ago. And then I started working more in investment management, asset management, focus on investing in farmland and forestry. So my first job was with a company in large asset manager in the UK, investing in a global portfolio of farms, including Poland, Romania, so Eastern Europe. And then once COVID hit, I moved I started working for SLM Partners. And throughout this journey, I was trained, and my background is a very conventional, traditional agriculture. But over the last 10 years, I've developed a very strong interest about carbon farming, regenerative agriculture, sort of looking at farming from a different angle, so to say. So not only on the production side and the economics, but also the impact of farming into the wider spectrum of things, such as climate change, such as biodiversity, such as quality of the food that we produce.
Exactly, and here there's my another question, because you started, saying that you are we are coming from the conventional farming, but then there was some switch also in your thinking and approach. And I would like to ask you, how do you explain the difference between the regenerative and sustainable agriculture to someone who is unfamiliar with these terms, to someone who still doesn't understand the difference? Also by your personal thinking, but maybe by also some mission and vision of SLM Partners, if you just can briefly put some difference on that terms.
Right, that's a good question. So just let me continue a bit about my trajectory. And I started working for SLM Partners because it was the company that it was within this space of investing in farmland, was the one that had been the pioneer in promoting this more different types of farming, more ecologically driven systems, regenerative farming, and so on. So there was a clear alignment when I joined the firm that this is how I want to pursue my career, like focusing more on this novel and different types of agriculture. So that was kind of a bit of an alignment of personal interests with what SLM has been doing. So back to your question about regenerative agriculture and conventional and the differences. I think there's been a lot of talk and hype and discussion and news around regenerative agriculture, especially in the last 5 years. The term has become very popularized, as being discussed, but there's still a clear lack of definition. I think if you Google regenerative agriculture, you might come up with probably 15 different definitions on what it is, and is unlike organic, where there's very specific protocols, be it the USDA organic certification or the European certification. So there's a very a clear set of guidelines so people understand what's conventional and what's organic. When you go into regenerative agriculture, things can be a lot unclear because there is no clear definition, there are no set of standards, there is no certification. So there's a bit of an issue in there, but if you go down to how we perceive SLM Partners and how I've been sort of in this journey, I think the main difference is coming from the farmer side of things, is that a farmer that's pursuing these new systems or a regenerative system has very clear in mind what are his goals from managing his land. And his goals are not only focusing on making money or having the highest yields and so on. So it starts with having a holistic thinking about what will my land deliver to me and to society. And then you go into the details of what are those core principles and having that clear in mind as a farmer. So these are like focusing on improving your soil health, improving the quality of what you produce, trying to implement practices that adapt your farm to new climate change challenges and volatility in climate. You try to farm in a system that's probably better for you, is less stressful, maybe you're using less chemicals. So there's a social element to that as well. So also other things like improving the water cycle, improving the food quality. So from a farm, it's a very different way of thinking, because you're trained and you've been doing things in a very specific way without thinking in a broader side of things. So when I think about regenerative agriculture and from a farming standpoint, generally the farmers that are more advanced in their transition, they have very clear in mind what they want to achieve with their system, and then the core principles and the beliefs, and then you have a number of practices that we discussed here yesterday. So you have that you can implement in your system to really make this transition happen, and then you deliver the outcomes that you're expecting. But it's more the sense of like having probably take one step back, think what do you want to achieve with your farm more holistically, and then finding the practices that work in your context. Might be in a grazing context, could be very different to a cropping context. It might be the practices that we've been discussing, so cover cropping, no-till, using of biologicals and different types of biological amendments. Can it be more like in the wider side of the farm, like planting hedgerows, planting flower strips to improve the overall sort of like resilience of the farm? So that's very bespoke and very personal to the farmer. It needs to be set within the context of how he's farming, the climate, the soil. But that's what I think is a big difference. So the conceptual way, or the way the farmer looks at his farm and what's trying to achieve, these outcomes that I was mentioning before, the soil health, the improvement in water cycles, improvement in food quality, and then how he decides what the practices that work for him. And it's always backed by a lot of the scientific literature and the practical examples I think we've been seeing the last 10, 15 years, which is really supporting the transition. So all these practices have been validated scientifically. There's still a lot of probably lack of communication between academia and the practice, but I think the transition will be easier, and it is easier for the farmers today than it was 15 years ago, for instance.
Yes, this is very interesting what you said about individual approach to every farmer. Sometimes I think that it would be great to have designers who are, like advising the farmers, but they design the system for them. I mean, they create some spaces for habitats, or for example, the species, increasing the biodiversity, and also trying to make a complex picture of what the farmers can implement in a specific geographical condition. And this is also interesting that SLM philosophy puts nature at the core of investment strategy. What does enhancing natural capital mean in your day-to-day work? For example, using a Garwin project in Australia as an example, where SLM implemented holistic grazing to restore degraded land and build ecological and financial resilience.
Right. Yeah. The term of natural capital sometimes, probably similarly to regenerative agriculture, is not a well understood topic, but in the context of farming and investments in agriculture and forestry, we look at a piece of land and the biological assets that the land supports as a set of assets and natural assets and an ecosystem. So when you're looking about how you're going to farm that land, you think about this not only from a production side, but you're also looking at it from what the farm can deliver more broadly. So in a lot of cases, because we deal with generally like larger farms, we have the opportunity to really optimize the land use for different purposes. And by that, what I mean is that you might set aside some areas for natural regeneration. You might restore riparian areas within a farm. You might plant some trees in some specific areas that are less suitable for farming production. And then within your farming system, you might be looking at how do you optimize the land use and integrate different sort of regenerative practices. So you're looking for the farm as a whole, not only as the production system that you're pursuing, and what this can deliver. And if you have this broader approach to the farm design and the land management, not only focus on the production side, you can improve the farm as a whole, like the natural habitats you have on the farm, the farming area, the soil health, the water quality of the farm, reduce runoff. So we think about all this sort of wider approach to the land that you're managing, not only the farming area, as means to improve the ecological resilience of the farm, improve habitat that will have benefits as well to the production part of the farm, where you have more pollinators, you have more natural predators that fight pests and disease, and these things all sort of impact on the resilience of the farm, and ultimately we believe as well that impacts on the profitability of the farm. So within the project that you mentioned, the Garwin project in Australia, is a very specific project, is a large-scale farm, one of the largest farms we have in Australia, so it's 80,000 hectares, so it's a very large-scale, extensive grazing. And there we have developed a carbon project. So before that, so in Australia, in this kind of system, you have generally like very large areas, very few fields, like you might have like in 80,000 hectares, you might have 5 different fields. The animals are spread across the property. They don't move around too much, and it's natural grasslands, and they tend to overgraze the land. It's an area that gets drought and is prone for climate variability. So the animals, they overgraze. The land managers don't take the animals out when it's needed. So the land has been getting degraded over time, like more bare soil, less plant diversity. And the way that we approach that is like really investing a lot of infrastructure to split the farm in a lot of different fields and paddocks. So we can be moving the animals as a whole herd, so the animals, they don't stay constantly across the farm. So we're moving them as mimicking like natural herds, like the bison in the US and the herbivores of Africa. So you're moving them across the land and allowing very short grazing periods and very long rest. So the animals might go back to the same spot that they grazed before after like 1 year or 18 months. So you allowed for the land regeneration over that period. And in that specific context of Garwin, it's an area that has these specific trees called moga trees. They're like kind of like tree, shrub-like plant that historically people in that area have been clearing it in principle, they believe that it will improve grass productivity, but and also as when there's a drought, they cut down the trees, and the animals, the sheep especially, they eat the leaves of the plants. So those trees are huge carbon stocks, and then when you clear those trees, all the carbon gets released to the atmosphere. So the project there involves. So you're not clearing those trees even in drought periods. So you're holding that carbon on the trees, and you also the grazing management that you're performing. You allowed for the natural regeneration of so the trees don't get grazed by the animals, and also there's a natural regeneration of the seedlings that are on the ground because there's a long period of where the animals are not there eating the plants. So the carbon project is based on the emissions avoidance from the trees that are not being cut down, and also the growth of the existing trees and so on. So this is a clear example of the grazing that has improved the grassland quality and productivity, while also improving the tree canopy and the number of trees on the farm, which are storing a lot of carbon. So there's a clear win there, because better productivity for the livestock, and also the ability to sell carbon credits in Australia from those trees. Very different to when we talk about carbon markets in an agricultural setting in Europe or in the US. Everything is generally focused on the soil carbon, so that's all the methodologies and the models, and the methodologies are focused on measuring and monetizing soil carbon, whereas this specific methodology in Australia that we're doing, it's more the above ground, the trees that are in the system, and monetizing the carbon that's on the trees. So that's a bit of a difference I want to highlight.
Many thanks for presenting this difference between focusing on soil, but also, as we know, I think it will be great to also focus on avoiding the emission. Also, I have a reflection about 2 issues. The first one is based on the concept which you presented. Similarly, in the European Union, there is a term like a One Health, so that we look holistically on the, for example, human health, and we are not only focusing on some of the parts, but also it will be great to have that approach that we try to produce healthy food, and then we can avoid, for example, diseases and so on. And here I see this kind of approach that when you look holistically on the farm, then you keep you take care not only of the yield and the size of the yield, you also take care of the resources and everything else. And secondly, based on this example, I see that in that context, the big farms can also have some advantages. There are, of course, many of them, but that you can easier manage the resources if the farm manager is willingness to do it, because I mean, people make decisions and people are responsible for some reality in our world, So now, when you talk about this, example, I was thinking about the transition, and if it's possible that you can explain a bit the successful farm transition from conventional to regenerative management, supported by SLM Partners, for example.
Yeah, good question. Just to give a bit of a context, we invest globally as a firm. So we started in Australia, so we invest in different types of systems in Australia. We also invest in the US and Europe. So as we discussed before, every country has its own particularities and climate and so on, and the people as well that are involved. So we generally operate. Some investments we do directly. We hire the team and we set up everything from scratch in terms of the operations. In other cases, we buy and partner with farmers and we lease the land to them to manage the land on our behalf. In other instances, it's almost like a joint venture. We partner with very strategic partners and we co-manage the investments. So the transition might look very different based on that as well. Not only the practices that are being implemented, but also the type of who is implementing that on the ground, and the different crops that we manage. Just to give an example, like in Australia, we have extensive grass-fed production systems, but we also have been investing as well in wool production, cotton, cereals, oilseeds, macadamias and pecans. In Europe, we produce tree crops, orchards for olive oil production, nuts like pistachios, almonds and walnuts. And in the US, we have investments in the Midwest that are focused on soybean, corn, cereals and oilseeds. And then in the west coast of the US, California, Oregon State, and Washington. So we have citrus, nuts, olives, and so it's a very broad range of systems that we operate in different geographies and different climates. So everything looks a bit different. But just to give a bit of an example how it looks like, we'll probably start with the more extreme cases, which provide a bit of context. So Australia, we've been managing the land there for over 10 years. It's very large-scale projects, as I said, very extensive, very dry, semi-arid, arid environment, and has been very challenging the previous 7 years, and has been a bit better now in terms of rainfall. But then the changes there can be very focused in the beginning on infrastructure. So we have around close to 300,000 hectares there, and then the changes from moving from set stock to this holistic grazing type of system, or mob grazing, the different ways of people call it, requires a lot of infrastructure development. So over there, we invested in over 5,000 kilometers of fencing, so developing the infrastructure to be able to move the animals across the land. We put up more than 100, close to 200 water troughs, so the animals can have the drinking water to move on the landscape, because generally when you have set stock, the animals overgraze on an area and they might not utilize a lot of the grass that's available there. So there is that, in this kind of context of grazing, there's a lot of investments in infrastructure. There will be fencing and water, so you can move the animals across the land and let the land rest for a longer period of time. So when you get improving the soil biodiversity, you improve soil carbon sequestration, and you also, in that case, where it's a natural grasslands, so it's not planted species. So we've been seeing a huge change in the composition of the grasses. More perennial grasses, they're better for for production, but they're also better for the soil because they keep the soil covered and so on. So that's a very specific example, like the grazing, where there's a changing mindset on how you manage the animals, but also there's a huge investment in infrastructure to allow to do that. When you go into the US, for instance, we basically transition systems from conventional agriculture to organic. So there's a very specific pathway to convert to organic. So it's the removal of chemicals, implementing practices. It might be like no-till or might be minimal tillage. It will be generally like extending and diversifying the crop rotation a lot. So you might, in some cases in the Midwest, you have, let's say, corn, soybean under rotation that doesn't really change. So it's always one back-to-back. You grow soybean one year, you grow corn another year. So we are generally trying to extend and diversify the crop rotation by adding a different legume, by adding a different cereal in the mix. So moving from 2 crops to potentially 5, 6 crops over the rotation. And also really promoting cover cropping, because there you have generally one crop season, generally like a spring crop, and keeping the ground covered in winter. So generally growing a cover crop in winter to cycle nutrients, keep the soil covered, and so on. That's, again, a very specific transition. And in Europe, with 3 crops orchards, again, is very different because it's a orchard setting, so permanent planting. So you're originally taking like land that's under cereals and planting an orchard, like trees for nuts or olives. So there's the big change is actually adding the trees into the system. And then the transition, it will be into a lot of the conventional farmers, they will have bare ground. They will be like sort of either tilling the in between the trees or spraying, keeping the ground cover dead. So we're transitioning to leaving plants for the longest as possible. So we're just really focusing on cover crop management. There's a lot of things in terms of we're using like soil probes for irrigation management. We're installing deep subsurface drip irrigation that has a real focus on improving water efficiency and saving water, because Mediterranean climates, so it's like dry environments where these trees, the seasons we're pursuing, they are irrigated. So having the drip irrigation subsurface, you're saving up to 30% on the water they're using. So there's a clear benefit there. We're using soil probes, satellite imageries, drones to track the health of the trees and the health of the canopy, to really have a more precise management on when the trees are stressed, to intervene with integrated pest management solutions, and when to apply fertilizers, when to apply specific products, growing the cover crops. There's a lot of pruning involved, and generally people would prune, take the biomass out and potentially burn it or take it out of the farm. What we're doing, so we all the pruning residues, we chop them, mulch them, and leave on the soil. So there's a lot of steps, and there's always more to be done. There's always new learnings in this system. So it's kind of like an ongoing journey on how you transition and develop those systems. And there's not a very clear pathway on how this transition looks like in different places, different climate contexts, different soils, and different farmers who actually implement that, because it always comes down to the farmer aptitude for change. And some changes are very easy for some farmers, and some changes not very easy. And what might be easy for someone, it might not be easier. So we respect that in the transition. So we don't have a very prescriptive guideline of this has to be done. So that we keep it open sometimes for the dialogue and the pace of that transition. That might take 5 years. That might take even longer, depending on how you want to accelerate and de-risk the transition. So not doing everything in year 1 and then not working, and then deciding that doesn't work and not doing anymore. So there's a lot of trial and error in the process, and doing it sort of slowly, so it's consistent and it's more and probably sticks for longer, and then you can really see the benefits over the long term.
It's kind of long-term support, yeah.
Yep.
And thank you for sharing, examples from 3 continents. I think it's rich experience if you can have insight from Australia, then United States, for example, and and also Europe, because you see how you can adapt your programs and how you can manage your assets. Now, Augusto, can you explain the mechanics of how you generate and sell carbon, credits or certificates, like for example, ACUS in Australia or some other? How does it work? Your mechanism of support on that field?
Right. So we're not project developers. So we own the farms and we operate the farms. So we're not in the business of developing the project. So we always rely on carbon project developers, the likes of Soil Capital, as you had an interview with Yannick yesterday in presenting here. So we rely on partners to develop those projects, and there isn't a lot of, as you said, we've been farming in different continents and different countries, and carbon markets, they're very different everywhere. To be honest, there's not a very consensus and sort of replicability of carbon markets everywhere. So there is every country is a different country. So you need to look at the local carbon developers and sort of follow and work with them to see what are the specific methodologies they're using and guidelines, and what generates the credits, to understand deeply what are the mechanisms that generate the credits, and it will be very different depending on the country. So in Australia, for instance, as I mentioned before, the Garin project is maybe taking it one step back. So Australia is very different to Europe and the US in the sense that the carbon market there for agriculture is a regulated market. So it's a market that was created by the government, and the government manages a lot of so it manages the regulations. They created the market. The government, through its research institutions, developed as well the methodologies for agriculture. And then there's a few methodologies that can be applied for agriculture. There's a livestock production, soil carbon methodologies, environmental plantings if you're planting trees in the system. There's methodologies for forestry, to planting commercial timber. So there's a number of methodologies that a farmer can use on his farm, following different sort of methods. But these methods have been developed and validated by the government. The government also runs the registry where the carbon credits are issued. So the government controls that part of the process as well. And that gives a lot of reliability and transparency and rigor in the carbon market there, because it's owned by the government has been very proactive in keeping that transparency and reliable and science-based. So it's a that different thing in that sense compared to other markets. And then how do you go about? And then another step that's important to say about Australia was that the government stepped in the beginning as the main buyer of carbon credits from farmers, because the voluntary markets and the regulated compliance markets weren't in place yet. So the government said, we will set up a fund. They put a few $100 billion in this fund to buy the credits from the farmers, to provide liquidity and off-take agreements for up to 10 years. So the farmers would have clear visibility on the income they would generate and how much credits they're going to generate over, like, say, a 10-year period of time. And that lowers the barrier for entry for a lot of farmers, saying, look, this is an investment I need to make in terms of doing soil testing. And in Australia, it's different to in Europe, that a lot of the carbon methodology there is based on actual soil testing. So you're measuring soil carbon at different points in time, and then you're issuing the credits based on what's being sequestered, not modeled. But the government creating this framework, the regulations, the methodologies, and providing and being the buyer, it really accelerated this transition in Australia and make it a lot easier. And what has happened in the last 5 years is that there's been an upcoming voluntary market. So the corporates are buying the credits as well from the farmers at a higher price from the government. So the government provides a floor pricing, and the corporates, they pay generally a higher price for so it's a pure supply-demand mechanism for pricing the carbon. And it's very transparent, so everyone knows what the price is. It's clear. There's data around it, so the farmer kind of can know what's happening. And also, with regards to the new regulation that's coming up, which is they call like the safeguard mechanism. So Australia is basically going to put hard targets for the largest emitters in the country. That's the 1,000 most polluting industries industries and companies in the country, setting very specific targets for them for emissions reductions for like 10% per 5% per year for 10 years. So if they don't manage to reduce their emissions, they will need to go and buy offsets in the market, and that's mostly coming from agriculture projects. So you have this clear demand pool from voluntary market, the government was buying credits, and now you have this compliance market where the largest emitters will have to reduce emissions, and if they can reduce fully, they will need to buy offsets in the market. So it's a very specific, it's a very mature market comparison to Europe and the US, and it's easier to see how much money you're going to spend to develop a project and how much money you're going to get out of it. So whereas in Europe, I think it's still like early stages, but you have things popping up in the insetting and certificates side of things that are quite interesting, which probably is more of a value chain alignment of emissions reductions and mitigation. So I think it really should be coming from the value chain. So the food companies, they have very specific targets on emissions reductions, and most of their Scope 3 emissions will be coming from their supply chains and their procurement. So it, to me, makes a lot of sense to promote the insetting of carbon emissions and promote carbon sequestration within the food value chain, as opposed to purely focusing on offsets. So it's exciting to see that there's companies like Soil Capital doing this here in Europe and partner with the food companies and providing a sort of like a product and an offering to farmers to accelerate the transition and the adoption of more regenerative practices.
SLM shows that regenerative agriculture can be both profitable and resilient. What are the key factors that make it financially attractive to investors? Because we have to have a funds for that, and it's not just the promising of farmers that if they implement some practices that they will be very happy and successful. We always have to have a capacity to provide these resources. How are we able to persuade the investors that it can be profitable for them, and also how you make them interest as a specialist?
Good question. There's, from different angles, there's always the farmer angle on what's achievable, what he wants to do with the land, and what's the outcomes he wants to get from implementing these practices. But from the investor side, investors that we deal with are generally large-scale institutional investors, and when they invest in farmland or timberland, they have a specific set of goals when they invest in there. So they want to diversify their investments from other asset classes into real assets, what we call it. So when you invest in farmland and forestry, you're investing in something that's tangible, that's real, is linked to the real economy, and historically has provided very strong risk-adjusted returns, what we call it. So lower levels of volatility comparison to other, like to shares and equity and bonds and these sort of things. Lower levels of volatility and high returns. And the returns comes from, you probably know, here in Poland, land prices have been steadily increasing over the last 30, 40 years consistently. So investors will get the return from the underlying asset, the farmland and the forest, the appreciating in value. And they also get the return from what is being produced on the land. So investors will have that in mind. So they want to diversify their investments, and they want to invest in something that has long-term ability to generate capital returns from the land appreciation and income from what's being produced on the land. So this is why people invest in forestry and agriculture. And the angle that we're approaching it is that if you invest in farmland, and you can deliver additional benefits for the investor, and the systems that we're implementing will provide more resilience, climate change adaptation. They provide as well access to a better markets. For instance, in the US, we're promoting strategies that are fully organic. So, and there's a very strong organic demand there. So there's a clear benefit in terms of like you're tapping into a niche market that's value add, that's in some context specifically is delivering a lot of like higher financial return. But then also you have promoting systems that are tapping to the carbon markets. So you're generating additional returns from carbon, for access to premium markets. So it is we're pursuing strategies that will enhance the returns from the farmland, not only from production, from the commodities they're producing, but then tapping into these other sources of income from carbon, from organic market premiums, and so on. And we truly believe that the systems and the practices that we're implementing will provide more resilience to the farm in terms of climate change mitigation. A lot of the areas that we farm, it can be quite volatile climates. So you have long periods of drought. You have periods where you have proper flooding. So when you have your land with more ground cover, with better soils, more structured, better aggregates, so we're making sure that a lot of our natural capital, the soil, doesn't get eroded, washed away. The water that falls infiltrates and is retained on the soil for longer, so the crops have a better chance to grow and produce and yield better on the long term. So it's always with a view of a long-term investment, and the practices are always, as we discussed in the beginning, like we have clear in mind what we want to achieve with the investment, and the horizon might be 10, 15, or 20 years' time. And we have the benefit of having investors that are supportive to that transition. So, which is not the case for a lot of farmers. They might not have the financial and the economic capacity to endure maybe longer periods of drought and lower returns. But we're fortunate to be in a position to really stick to what we believe in the farming systems we want to promote by having this very long-term view. Farmers generally they can have the long-term view because they want to pass the farm to the another generation and so on, but sometimes they're stuck in a system where they're financially constrained to make the changes, or in a lot of cases, in a lot of parts of the world, the farmers are in their 60s or approaching their 70s. So the desire to really change things, it's not there. So it will need to come from the younger generations that are stepping into their business. So that's probably a bit of reality in the US. I mean, most of the developed world, where the average age of the Australian farmer is probably in their mid-60s, in the US is the same, and in Europe is the same. So a lot of the transition and the changes will probably come from the younger generations that are more keen to take those risks and will have a longer career ahead of them to make those changes, as opposed to just focusing on what they have to do before retirement, so to say. So that's a bit of a timing perspective as well.
Very fluently, you came to my another question. So thanks a lot for that. It's great that when we discuss, and then I want to ask you some questions and you start answering for that question. So I like it very much. So can you tell me how SLM Partnership support the next generation of regenerative farmers, especially younger or first generation land managers? Because as you said, young people, young farmers are our future.
Yeah, no, that's a very important part of the piece as well, and how we operate. I'll give the example, which is a bit more concrete in the US, and then I probably can expand a bit on that. The US, basically, our model is it's a buy and lease model. So the research that we done before we invested there was what are the barriers, the key barriers for farmers to adopt regenerative practices and to transition specifically to organic farming practices. And the roadblocks are generally that the transition period, especially in an organic system, you might get lower yields in the first 3-4 years. There's issues as well that you're not able to sell your produce to organic prices, so you have lower yields and lower production, so that's not very good for your bottom line. And in the US specifically, the farmers, generally the leases they're like annual or biannual leases. So for the farmer that wants to transition, these leases of very short duration leases are not very suitable for them because they need security on a lease for at least ideally 10 plus years, so they can really implement things and also de-risk their transition to organic and to regenerative practices. So what we've been doing there, so we identify like a bunch of farmers basically that are doing regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture. They have been doing this on their own land. They want to expand. Maybe the son wants to expand the father's business, and they're generally a bit younger. In the US, the average age is around sort of mid-late 30s. So they're like 20 years younger than the average farmer in the US. And these are very sort of keen farmers to expand their business and to get more land. And they had challenges in getting more land to do the transition because of the short-term leases they're offered, so they cannot farm the land. They need to renew the lease every year, and then the landowner might kick them out of the land after 2 years. So it's very hard for them to implement the changes that have a long-term nature. And also this period of transition can be a bit more challenging economically. So what we have done, we devised very specific lease contracts. They are long-term, 10-year plus. And during this organic transition and regen ag transition period, we offer a below market rate lease. So they're paying a lower lease payment or rent for SLM during the period. So we buy the land, we establish these lease contracts with the farmer, and during this 4 years period, they pay lower rent. So it's easier for them to transition, so that it's less of an economic burden for them during the transition, and they have the security they're going to be farming that then for at least 10 years. And then once that 3-4 years ends, we enter into the leases are more of a base lease and a profit sharing agreement. So they start to get the benefits from the organic market sales and premiums, and then they have a base lease, and then if there's a profit above a certain level, then we get a percentage of that return as well. So it's to the benefit of the farmer because they don't have a lot of downside risk, and then if things go really well, then we as a company, we also benefit a bit from them improving their soils, getting higher yields, lowering their cost of production, and also getting to these premium markets like organics or maybe some regenerative certifications that will be able to sell their produce at a higher price. So that's kind of how we promote the entrance for these farmers. They're generally a lot younger on average in the US, the farmers that we were partnered with, and without this kind of more flexible arrangements, they would really struggle to find more land to farm. So that's how we partner there. In Australia, it's different because we have our own teams, but the team is very focused on disseminating and spreading the word about what we do. So we run conferences, we run trainings with other people. We try to educate other sort of land managers on how we've been doing things and how we've been doing differently and the benefits of it. So there's like building the team at first and really training the people that are working on the farm. So there's a big component on training and getting young people to do that. But then there's a wider benefit of knowledge transfer between what we do on our farms with the wider sort of community around us over there in Australia. So that's two angles from.
coming from the youngest to a bit of future trends and some innovations, I would like to ask you, how do you see the integration of a tech like for example remote sensing or AI in supporting the regenerative farm management? Because we know that you have to have a data set and also know how to manage, operate the models and so on. And I think also the young generation farmers, they can easier adapt all of this innovations. So I would like to ask you how your company and also you as in general the group of people invest in that kind of methods.
Right. As a company, we don't invest directly in technology companies or ag tech or startups or these technologies, but we are users of technology. And I think about technology, I think it's quite interesting and has been improving a lot. It's providing the tools and the insights and the knowledge to the farmer to make better decisions, and that's where it comes to. I don't think technology is there to replace the farmer's decision and the farmer's intuition on how he should farm the land, but it's providing better tools for the farmer to implement things and to be more active in managing this land, his land, and so on. There's a lot of, in Australia we use a lot of remote sensing to track where the animals are on the land, because we have the very specific maps and remote sensing to show grass production in different parts of the land. So this helps the decision making. As we discussed, it's very extensive areas, close to 300,000 hectares. So the farmer's ability to be, on a motorbike or on a quad bike, on a just checking the status of all this, all the farm is quite hard. So they do that. They move the animals across the land, so they see that. But satellite imagery is really helping in terms of showing biomass production and this sort of thing. So help the decision making of how, when, and how you manage the livestock across the land. So that's and where the animals are. More specifically. So that's a very specific type of technology there that's simple, but it's helpful. Then we have like water sensors on the water troughs where the animals, we have many, and that checks the water levels on the trough. So that you get messages and you check the water quantity on the trough, so the animals there don't run out of water. So some technologies are very basic like this, but they got quite impactful and make a big difference in how you're managing. Saves you a lot of time from having to go there and check if the animals have water, and then make sure that the animals don't go under stress as well. If you go into the more cropping and orchard systems, then the technologies are very different. You might be talking about remote sensing and precision agriculture technology. So we're implementing, for instance, controlled traffic and variable rate application of inputs, for example, in Australia in row crops. So as the person speaking about robotics yesterday in the robots, so the idea that controlled traffic farming, so you have the tractor is only driving in one specific path, so you're not compacting the soil, and then you're using drone and also data from the tractors to understand pest and disease pressure, when to intervene, the soil maps that underlie the soil maps that you have, and fertility maps to do variable rate application. So it's very powerful tools for you to, and cost savings tools for you to really provide what the plants need, and also save on input use. And then by default you're reducing nitrates going to the soil and the water streams, and phosphates, so it's a more targeted nutrition plan. And then you have for example in orchards, to me orchards are more like high-tech set of things where you have is high value crops. So we're doing so we have soil probes, we have something, it's called endometers, that measure the expansion and of the tree trunk that's related to how they absorb water. So if there's indicators to say when you need to water the plants based on the soil probes, based on how the tree trunk is moving. And also we have meteorological sites on the farm that will be sort of providing all this insight into when you should apply the water. And then the drones, they measure nowadays, very interesting, like it measures chlorophyll levels on the plants, and they measure potential stress. So there's, based on the different spectrum of the colors, you can see if the trees are under water stress or maybe pest and disease. So you can clearly see that, and then you go and check on site what's happening. And then if you see, oh, there's a disease pressure, there's insects attacking the plant, or there maybe the pipe of water is burst, there's too much water, there's no water flowing there, so you can address those issues. So I think that's where technology can be very, very powerful in helping the farmer to make better decisions.
Lots of aspects and lots of issues, but this is a very, I think, also powerful and perspective tool. So Augusto, we are almost going to the end. It's really great, lots of insights and information share. But I would like to ask you now about our context, about what kind of potential do you see of scaling regenerative agriculture in Central and Eastern Europe, because we are here in Poland, but also there are many partners of us from countries around Poland, and what if you can maybe find some parallels to your work in Iberia or Ireland. So yeah, this is a interesting question also for us.
Yeah, I think the potential of Central and Eastern Europe as an agricultural producing hub, and also as a place for implementing a lot of these regenerative practices and different farming systems is enormous. You have in Eastern Europe probably a lot of the best soils in Europe. So you have vast agricultural land across all the countries. You have favorable climate. You have good soils, and you still have a very thriving and large farming population. And if you look in comparison to other countries, like farming and agricultural sector still represents a bigger part of the economy, employs more people than others. So I think there's still a bit of people are probably a bit more connected to agriculture and farming. So you have the human capital still to farm and so on more than probably other places, and you have good soils and farmers. Sometimes there's issue with like land fragmentation, very small areas, and the aging population and so on, which is across the board. But I think in terms of the potential for implementing those practices in Central and Eastern Europe is equally good or better than in other parts of Western Europe or in the US. And then I think the key thing as well, I think it's a tremendous job that the research institutes and the academia is doing in terms of really testing, trialing, validating these practices from a scientific angle, and then the EU, I think, plays a very good role in taking that information that's sitting in academia, which sometimes doesn't get transferred to the farmers in a good way. So I think it's very important the science, the validation of these practices, and then having a very clear way of educating and transferring this information to the farmers. And the medium and the ways that this can be done, it can vary a lot. I think there's probably a role for governments, the EU in the case of Europe, to really package that information and provide to farmers. There's trainings and materials and information sort of dissemination to different platforms. But there's also, I think, the role for the private sector in terms of agricultural consultants and food companies and value chains to really sort of start to make more active, take more active steps on really helping the farmers in that transition, because it's not easy. It's more knowledge intensive, I think, in some ways. It might require capital investments into maybe some machinery and so on. So every case is different. But I think there's nothing stopping Central Europe and Eastern Europe from you. There's amazing soils, great land, human capital, like very knowledgeable farmers, and farmers are still on the land to implement these systems in Europe. And hopefully you get better policies, more certainty from the EU in terms of the subsidy regimes, the cap, and delivery of initiatives like the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork. So really accelerates and provides the farmer the support to do the transition. The carbon payments help as well, because I think they're like not only the payments of the carbon, but also the infrastructure and the advice that the carbon project developers are providing to the farmers. So you might have an agronomist, they will come to your farm and explain that these practices will have an impact on your soil. So it gets the farmer thinking about the benefits of that. They're not only monetary from getting a carbon payment, or it's as well from a soil health perspective and so on. So I think this contact as well, coming from the private sector, can be quite powerful to start a conversation and drive the change.
At the end, I would like to ask you last question. I always ask this question, and from our perspective, it's very interesting to know what is your opinion. So, if you had one message to share with farmers, investors, and policy makers listening to this podcast, what would it be?
Right. So different target groups, different solutions, and different ideas.
One message per one group.
One message per group, maybe. Yeah. I generally try to refrain from answering these broad questions about or advice that can be quite complex, and sometimes you don't have the full perspective of the complexities and the challenges within each one of these policymaking and investors to make a sound judgment of what would be the best approach forward. But coming from the investor side, I think investing in farmland, investing in timberland or natural real assets, natural capital, is a very powerful tool to drive change and get sound economic returns. So you can get exposure to that asset class, which will deliver long-term and has delivered long-term very good risk-adjusted returns. So low levels of volatility, good capital appreciation over time, and income generation, and choose the operators and the the groups that are managing land in a way that will also deliver positive impact to the wider society. So, and that means, as we discuss, climate change adaptation and mitigation, that the farm, realistically, if you look at Europe and in terms of farmland and forestry, it makes up the vast majority of the land in Europe. And so if you're not investing in the backbone of kind of society and food production and timber production things and the land, you're not going to be tackling climate change, you're not going to be tackling loss of biodiversity, and you're not going to be tackling, as you mentioned before, the human health component of things, which has the wide impact to society. So the idea of promoting systems that are better for biodiversity, they're better for ecology, they're better for water, for soil, for climate, that produce higher quality food that's better for people, they're more nutritious food, and so on. So I think for investors, there's a very clear message. Investing in farmland and timberland is not only good from a financial standpoint, but you're delivering a very positive impact across the wider society. For policymakers, that's an area don't want to be touching too deeply. But I think the key thing from a policymakers is having the vision. I think EU has had a very clear vision with the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategies and execution. There's a lot of funding happening, so I think there is the vision there. Sometimes maybe the execution can be more problematic, and what kind of farmers need and investors need is probably a bit more certainty on outcomes. When you look at the cap, there's always changes, and then farmers get incentivized to do something, and then the incentives get either removed or changed. So like having more consistency on the approach and the details around what makes up good, sound carbon farming practices, and then how do you incentivize them without disincentivizing a lot of things. Because the issue with I mean, I come from a background in farming in Brazil and then in Australia, where it's the level of government intervention and subsidies is minimum. So farmers they will implement practices based on generally purely economic drivers. So the levers are quite different in terms of how people implement changes on the farm. It's generally driven not by subsidies but by the economic reality of the farming. Whereas here in Europe, it's great that you have level of support from policymakers from the EU, for instance, and subsidies, but making sure that they are consistent and that they deliver the outcomes that they're supposed to, and not incentivize specific things and then disincentivize a lot of other things that are also important. Good case that's happening now in the UK, they restructured the whole subsidy regime for farmers, their Sustainable Farming Initiative, which is supposed to replace the cap. They came out and did a very good work in terms of establishing how that would work and the payments that the farmers would get for specific practices that they adopt. But then it wasn't really well thought through. They basically blew up the budget because they had very specific practices. They had high adoption, they had high payments, and then the farmers went for these low-hanging fruits and like planting, let's say, flower strips. Then everyone in there planted flower strips, got the money, and then didn't focus on implementing other more meaningful practices that maybe like no-till or cover cropping and so on. And then they spend all the money on specific practices at the detriment of other things. And then now they stop completely the subsidies. The farmers are in the limbo. They're not getting paid. They don't know when they're going to get paid, and they don't know what they need to do. So there's a lot of issues in terms of policy making, in like being clear with what the farmer should do, the bureaucratic burden of complying with those metrics, and not creating these incentives with subsidy schemes and inaction in some ways. I think for farmers, the last group, I didn't want to. Sorry, farmers, for leaving you as the last group. But I think
last but not least, yeah.
The farmers are probably in some ways the easiest group to convince that the realities of farming has changed. The threat from climate and climate-related issues are real, and by that I mean we know that soils are being degrading over time. This is not only in Europe; this is across the globe. The resilience of the system is probably compromised because of poor soil health, poor resilience of the soil and the crops. The climate is becoming more volatile in terms of droughts, floods, higher temperatures. Cropping is shifting the life cycle in terms of windows for planting and harvesting a crop. Things are clearly changing, and farmers are noticing this more than anyone else in terms of this. So implementing a lot of these practices have been backed by science and academia are the best way for the farmer to improve the resilience of the system, improve the soil health, mitigate carbon emissions, sequester carbon, make the soils healthier, and create the ability of the soils to hold more water, so it's more resilient to droughts, and also when you have excess water, you'll be able to drain it more easily, and over the long run, they will deliver a more profitable and resilient system. It's just finding out the levers to help the farmers to pursue this new methods of farming, and it will come down to probably a lot of education, economic incentives through maybe carbon payments, maybe the right subsidy regime, and it's that's the angle. I think there's a bit of a consensus that there's positives and clear beneficial outcomes from pursuing a lot of these regenerative practices and carbon farming practices. It's more the question of providing the support to the farmers on how to really make those decisions and remove the uncertainty around that transition.
Okay. Augusto, it was really great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to talk with you. So many thanks for this discussion, and I wish you all the best in the next forthcoming weeks and months and years to implement and to support the regenerative farming. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Piotr and the team from Jung, and for this amazing conference that you've been hosting, and for having me here in the podcast, so that hopefully the message gets spread more widely, and hopefully I managed to provide some insights and some clarifications about what we do and the importance of what we do for agriculture and for the wider farming community. Thank you.